Hey everybody, this is a section from Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia. It's from 1948. The section's titled, Chapter 2 is titled The Economy of a Worker State. There might be some noise in the background, but hopefully it doesn't ruin the whole video. So the sections of this chapter are the transformation of capitalist relations of production into socialist relations of production, the division of labor and the division into classes, workers and technicians, labor discipline, workers and the means of production, the relations of distribution in the transition period, and conclusion. So here we go. I'm just going to read this as a standalone piece. I'm kind of like working through this book very slowly. If Russia is not a worker state, degenerated or otherwise, what is it, and how did Russia come to be what it is? We should answer this by tackling the following questions. What are the relations of production in a worker state? Why was it impossible to preserve such relations in a backward country under conditions of siege? What relations of production came in their place? How did the transition from one set of relations to another take place? What is common and different to these two sets of relations? Why do prevailing relations of production in Russia not express themselves in the additional relations of property? What are the laws of motion of Russian economy? The following chapters will attempt an answer to these questions. We shall begin in this chapter by analyzing the economy of a worker state. It is necessary, before considering the fundamental features of the economy of a worker state, to mention one very important factor. As Marx and Engels expected the revolution to begin in the developed countries, Marx and Engels assumed that from its inception, the new society would be materially and culturally more developed than the most advanced capitalist countries. Every prognosis, however, is conditional. History did not unfold exactly as Marx and Engels had expected it. It was in Russia, one of the most backward capitalist countries, the degree to which it's capitalist I think is pretty debatable, that the revolution first broke out and the workers took power, while the revolutions which followed in the more developed countries failed. Marx and Engels' analysis of the economy of a worker state in a developed country can serve as a norm with which we can compare the development in Russia, to show to what extent it conformed to it and then diverged from it and finally contradicted it. New section. Section 1. The transformation of capitalist relations of production into socialist relations of production. The development of the productive forces under capitalism creates the material conditions necessary for socialism. There are two sorts of productive forces, the means of production and labor power. The centralization of capital and the socialization of the labor process under capitalism becomes the basis of socialist production. Thus, of all the relations of production which prevail under capitalism, relations between capitalists and capitalists, between capitalists and workers, between the workers themselves, between technicians and workers, technicians and capitalists, etc., only one section is carried over into the socialist society, namely the relations obtaining between the workers in the process of production. The workers united through social production become the basis for new relations of production. Some elements in the relations of production existing under capitalism are abolished altogether by socialism through the abolition of the capitalist, while others, such as the, quote, new middle class, and, quote, technicians, accountants, etc., will be fitted into a new context. This, quote, new middle class constitutes part of the productive forces, and as such is a necessary element of production. However, its position in the hierarchy of capitalist society is a transitory one. As transitory as capitalism, socialism will do away entirely with this hierarchical position in the process of production above that of the proletariat. A new relationship will be created between the different elements necessary for the socialist mode of production, between mental and manual labor. The new relationship, to be dealt with more fully later on, begins to take shape with the transition period. The working class, which constitutes part of the productive forces and a part of the capitalist relations of production at one and the same time, becomes the basis for the new relations of production, and the point of departure for the development of the productive forces on the foundation of these relations. In the words of Marx, quote, "Of all the instruments of production, the greatest power is the revolutionary class itself. The organization of the revolutionary elements as a class presupposes the existence of the productive forces which could be engendered in the bosom of the old society." End quote. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. New section, Section 2, the division of labor and the division into classes. Engels writes, quote, "In every society in which production is developed spontaneously, and our present society is of this type, it is not the producers who control the means of production, but the means of production which control the producers. In such a society, each new lever of production is necessarily transformed into a new means for the subjection of the producers to the means of production. This is most of all true of that lever of production which, prior to the introduction of large-scale industry, was by far the most powerful, the division of labor." End quote. Engels. And that's from Anti-Düring. The division of labor, expressed in the separation of manual from mental labor, is of a historically transitory character. It has its roots in the separation of the workers from the means of production, and in the resultant antagonism of these two elements to each other. In the words of Marx, quote, "Intelligence in production expands in one direction because intelligence vanishes in many other directions. What is lost by the detail laborers is concentrated in the capital that employs the detail laborers. It is a result of the division of labor in manufactures that the laborer is brought face to face with the intellectual potencies of the material process of production as the property of another and as a ruling power. This separation begins in simple cooperation, where the capitalist represents to the single workman the oneness and the will of the associated labor. It is developed in manufacture, which cuts down the laborer into a detail laborer. It is completed in modern industry, which makes science a productive force distinct from labor and presses labor into the service of capital." End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 1. The complete victory of communism means the complete abolition of the separation of mental and manual labor. It would be impossible to abolish this separation immediately after the revolution, but workers' control over production will become an immediate bridge between mental and manual labor. But workers' control over production will become an immediate bridge between mental and manual labor, and the point of departure for their future synthesis, the total abolition of classes. And the point of departure for their future synthesis, the total abolition of classes. Here, we come to a problem which is fundamental from the standpoint of the transformation of the relations of production, of the bridge between mental and manual labor. New section, Section 3, Workers and Technicians. Technicians constitute a necessary element in the process of production, an important part of the productive forces of society, whether capitalist or communist. At the same time, as we have already said, under capitalism, technicians form a layer in the hierarchy of production. Technicians come into being as part and parcel of this hierarchy. The technician's monopolist position as regards the, quote, mental process of production, end quote, as Bukharin terms it, is the result of the separation of the workers from the means of production on the one hand and the socialization of labor on the other. Socialists will abolish this hierarchy, or socialism will abolish this hierarchy. It says socialist. Socialist, singular, will abolish this hierarchy. So I don't know if that's supposed to be socialists or socialism, but socialist doesn't make sense. So I'm assuming it's a typo. In the transition period, this hierarchy will continue to exist in one sense, but in another, be abolished. Insofar as mental labor remains the privilege of the few, the hierarchical relations will continue to exist in the factories, railways, etc., even after the proletarian revolution. But seeing that the place of the capitalist in the hierarchy will be taken by the workers' state, i.e. by the workers as a collective, the technicians being subordinated to the workers, the mental hierarchy in this sense will be abolished. Workers' control over technicians means the subordination of capitalist elements to socialist elements. The more efficient workers' control, the higher the material and cultural level of the masses, the more will the monopolist position of mental workers be undermined till it is completely abolished and a full synthesis of mental and manual labor achieved. I'm going to repeat a couple of those sentences because they were in italics. But seeing that the place of the capitalist in the hierarchy will be taken by the workers' state, i.e. by the workers as a collective, the technicians being subordinated to the workers, the mental hierarchy in this sense will be abolished. Workers' control over technicians means the subordination of capitalist elements to socialist elements. The more efficient workers' control, the higher the material and cultural level of the masses, the more will the monopolist position of mental workers be undermined, till it is completely abolished and a full synthesis of mental and manual labor achieved. Section 4. Labor discipline. Every form of social production needs the coordination of different people participating in social production. In other words, every form of social production needs discipline. Under capitalism, this discipline confronts the worker as an external coercive power, as the power which capital has over him. Under socialism, discipline will be the result of consciousness. It will become the habit of a free people. In the transition period, it will be the outcome of the unity of the two elements, consciousness and coercion. The state institutions will be the organization of the masses as a conscious factor. Collective ownership of the means of production by the workers, i.e. the ownership of the workers' state of the means of production, will be the basis for the conscious element in labor discipline. At the same time, the working class as a collective, through the working class's institutions, Soviets, trade unions, etc., will appear as a coercive power as regards the disciplining of the individual workers in production. Individualistic consumption, the quote, bourgeois right, end quote, as regards distribution, will serve as a method of coercive discipline. The technicians, supervisors, etc., have a special place in labor discipline. Under capitalism, the supervisor is the transmission belt through which capitalist coercion of the worker is exercised. Under communism, a supervisor will fulfill the same need as conductor of an orchestra. He will not fulfill any coercive function, as labor discipline will be based on consciousness and habit. In the transition period, whereas the workers, as regards themselves, will be both a disciplining and a disciplined factor, a subject and an object. The technician, even though they remain formally discipliners of the workers, in reality will serve only as a transmission belt, this time of the workers' state. New section, Chapter 5, The Workers and the Means of Production. The Communist Manifesto says, quote, in bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, end quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. In communist society, accumulation will be conditioned by the needs of consumption of the people. In capitalist society, accumulation determines the extent of employment and the rate of wages, i.e. the rate of consumption of the working people. Even as regards the capitalist himself, the factor that makes him a capitalist is not consumption, but accumulation. As Marx said, quote, accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake. By this formula, classical economy expressed the historical mission of the bourgeoisie and did not for a single instant deceive itself over the birth throes of wealth. End quote. Marx, Capital. The process of capitalist accumulation determines, limits, and undermines consumption. This is because the worker is dominated by the product of his labor. Communist consumption will determine the accumulation of means of production. This is because the laborer will dominate this product. This is because the laborer will dominate his product. In every society, whatever form the relations of production take, rationalization of production generally involves a more roundabout way of production, i.e. an increase in the proportion of the total social labor devoted to the production of means of production. This means an increase in the ratio of, quote, accumulation relative to the rate of consumption. Under communism, this increase in the rate of, quote, accumulation as against the rate of consumption would at the same time mean a large absolute increase in the consumption of the toilers. Under capitalism, however, because of the antagonistic way of distribution, the rate of surplus value increases, and thus also the rate of accumulation, while the rate of consumption of the masses remains a subordinate factor. The fact that under capitalism, accumulation for accumulation's sake is the result of two factors: one, the separation of the workers from the means of production; the other, the existence of competition between the capitalists, no matter whether individual, monopolist, or state. Socialism abolishes both these elements of the relation of production. Workers' control over production and the abolition of national boundaries. These are the two conditions for the full subordination of accumulation to consumption. Under such conditions, society will accumulate in order to consume. The subordination of accumulation to consumption, by raising the material and cultural conditions of the masses, will at the same time undermine the monopoly of the technicians over the, quote, mental means of production, end quote, and thus strengthen the workers' control over production. Section 6. The relations of distribution in the transition period. The most exact and concise analysis of this question was given by Marx in his Critique of the Gotha Program. Quote, what we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as this communist society has developed on this communist society's own foundation, but on the contrary, as communist society emerges. As communist society emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, deductions in the interest of society as a deduction in the interest of society as a whole, end bracket, exactly what he gives to it. What he has given to it is his individual amount of labor. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of the individual labor hours. The individual labor time of the individual producer is the part of the social working day contributed by him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such an amount of labor, parenthesis, after deducting his labor for the common fund, in parenthesis, and with this certificate, he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as costs the same amount of labor. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, he receives back in another. Here, obviously, the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as this is an exchange of equal values. Content and form are changed because under this altered circumstances, no one can give anything except his labor, and because, on the other hand, nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption. But as far as the distribution of the latter among the individual producers is concerned, the same principle prevails as in the exchange of commodity equivalents. So much labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form. Hence, equal right here is still in principle bourgeois right, although principle and practice are no longer in conflict, while the exchange of equivalents and commodity exchange only exists on the average and not in the individual case. In spite of this advance, this equal right is still constantly stigmatized by a bourgeois limitation. The right of the producers is proportional to the labor the producers supply. The equality consists in the fact that measurement is made with an equal standard, labor. But one man is superior to another physically or mentally and supplies more labor in the same time, or can labor for a longer time. And labor, to serve as a measure, must be defined by labor's duration or intensity, otherwise it ceases to be a standard of measurement. This equal right is an unequal right for unequal labor. This equal right recognizes no class differences because everyone is only a worker like everyone else, but this equal right tacitly recognizes unequal individual endowment and thus productive capacity as natural privileges. It is therefore a right of inequality in its content like every right. Right by its very nature can consist only in the application of an equal standard, but unequal individuals, and individuals would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are measurable only by an equal standard insofar as they are brought under an equal point of view, as taken from one definite side only, e.g. in the present case, are regarded only as workers, and nothing more is seen in them, everything else being ignored. Further, one worker is married, another worker is not, one worker has more children than another worker, and so on and so forth, thus with an equal capacity to work, and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another, one will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, right instead of being equal would have to be unequal. But these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as communist society is, when communist society has just emerged after the prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development thereby determined. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished, after labor has become not merely a means to live, but has become itself the prime necessity of life, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be fully left behind, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. End quote. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program. Back to Tony Cliff. Bourgeois right of the transition period includes its own negation, in order that the same amount of labor which every worker gives to society in one form, he receives back in another, even if the workers are different from one another in respect of their skill, their needs, and those of their families, etc. In one thing they must be absolutely equal, in respect of the ownership of the means of production. the advance of production, the increase of the amount of means of production belonging to society, i.e., owned equally by all the workers, will progressively undermine equal rights in the distribution of the products. This will in turn progressively increase equality among the people. Bourgeois right in the transition period. While it lays down that every worker will receive means of consumption from society according to the labor he gives society, is based on social equality as regards the means of production, and thereby will wither away of itself. Bourgeois right in the transition period. While bourgeois right lays down that every worker will receive means of consumption from society according to the labor that he gives society, is based on social equality as regards the means of production, and thereby will wither away of itself. New section, Section 7. In conclusion, the economy of a worker state and a capitalist economy have many common characteristics. As the worker state is a transition stage between capitalism and communism, the worker state inevitably includes some of the features of the society out of whose ruins the worker state arises, and some of the nuclei of the future society. These elements, antagonistic as these elements are bound together, the former being subordinated to the latter. Common to both the worker state and capitalism is the division of labor, primarily the division between mental and manual labor. The distinguishing feature is the existence or non-existence of workers' control over production. Workers' control forms the bridge, albeit a narrow bridge, to the abolition of the separation of manual and mental labor, which will be completely realized with the establishment of communist society. Common to both the worker state and capitalism is the fact that the technicians form a hierarchy above the workers, although in a worker state, in essence, it cannot really be called a hierarchy. The distinguishing feature lies in the fact that in a worker's state, the technicians are not subordinated to capital, but to the will of the worker's state, to the proletariat as a collective. This is the point of departure to the abolition of any social hierarchy in production. Elements of coercion and labor discipline will exist in a worker's state as well as in capitalism. But in a worker's state, unlike in capitalism, they will not be the only element. And they will be more and more subordinated to elements of consciousness until such time as social solidarity, harmonious relations between people, and education will altogether abolish the need for coercion in the process of production. In a worker state as well as in the capitalist commodity economy, equivalents are exchanged. A product containing a certain quantity of socially necessary labor is exchanged for another product containing an equivalent amount. But in a worker state, this result is achieved not through the action of blind forces, but through the conscious direction of the economy, besides which all the workers have equal rights in the ownership of the means of production. Bourgeois right under the bourgeoisie means exploitation. The bourgeois right of distribution in a worker state, quote, tacitly recognizes unequal individual endowment, and this productive capacity is natural privileges, end quote. But at the same time, bourgeois right of distribution in a worker's state declares the equality of producers towards the means of production. The point of departure of the bourgeois right of distribution in a worker's state is the non-existence of any exploitation whatsoever, and the evolution towards the total abolition of all economic inequality, even that resulting from natural individual endowment. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening. Again, this is chapter 2 of Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia from 1948. If you're interested, the next chapter, which I'll read as a separate thing, I'm not going to put them all up, is Chapter 1, Chapter 2, whatever, is The Material Heritage of Pre-October Society. So thank you so much for listening. The first chapter of this pamphlet or book is titled An Examination of Trotsky's Definition of Russia as a Degenerated Worker State, which is already on this channel. Thank you so much for listening.